The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of Thornfield Manor as Eleanor Whitmore stood in the grand library, her hands trembling as she held the letter that would change everything. The ornate chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany shelves, but Eleanor's attention was fixed entirely on the elegant handwriting that spelled out her worst fears. Margaret Thornfield, the family matriarch and Eleanor's mother-in-law, had been planning something in secret. The letter, accidentally delivered to Eleanor instead of Margaret's personal secretary, revealed a plot that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Margaret intended to challenge the inheritance arrangement that would see Eleanor's husband, James, inherit the family estate and business empire. Eleanor had married into the Thornfield family 5 years ago, bringing with her not only love for James, but also a sharp business mind that had helped the family's textile empire flourish during difficult economic times. She had modernized their operations, expanded into international markets, and increased profits by 40%. Yet Margaret had never fully accepted her, viewing Eleanor as an outsider who didn't understand the family's traditions and values. The letter detailed Margaret's plan to invoke an obscure clause in the family trust, one that would allow her to name a different heir if she could prove the current heir was unfit to maintain the family's honor and legacy. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Margaret intended to use James's past struggles with anxiety and his brief stint in therapy as evidence of mental instability. James had overcome his anxiety years ago, but Margaret had never forgiven what she saw as a sign of weakness. In her mind, the Thornfield name required strength, and any display of vulnerability was unacceptable. Eleanor knew that if Margaret succeeded, the inheritance would likely pass to James's younger brother, David, who had always been Margaret's favorite despite his reckless spending and numerous scandals. As Eleanor read further, she discovered that Margaret had been gathering evidence for months. She had spoken to James's former therapist, though bound by confidentiality. The doctor had apparently let slip some general comments about stress management during a chance encounter at a charity event. Margaret had twisted these innocent remarks into something sinister. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Eleanor quickly fold the letter. James entered the library, his face lighting up when he saw his wife. At 35, he still had the boyish charm that had first attracted Eleanor. The recent stress from managing the family business had added lines around his kind brown eyes. "You look troubled," James said, crossing the room to embrace her. "Is everything all right with the quarterly reports?" Eleanor hesitated. She knew she should tell James immediately about his mother's betrayal, but she also knew how deeply it would hurt him. James had always tried to please Margaret, believing that if he worked hard enough and proved himself worthy, she would finally show him the love and approval he craved. "The reports are fine," Eleanor said carefully. "James, I need to ask you something. Have you noticed your mother acting differently lately? More secretive, perhaps?" James frowned, considering the question. "Now that you mention it, she has been spending a lot of time with her lawyers recently. She said it was routine estate planning, but she's been very tight-lipped about it. Why do you ask?" Before Eleanor could respond, the library door opened again, and Margaret Thornfield entered with her characteristic regal bearing. At 68, she remained an imposing figure, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expensive clothes impeccably tailored. She had built her entire identity around being the guardian of the Thornfield legacy, and she commanded respect through a combination of old-world elegance and iron will. "Eleanor, James," Margaret said coolly, her sharp gray eyes moving between them. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Of course not, Mother," James replied quickly, always eager to maintain peace. "We were just discussing the business." Margaret's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Ah, yes, the business. How fortunate we are to have Eleanor's modern expertise guiding our family's affairs." Eleanor felt the subtle barb in Margaret's tone. Every compliment from Margaret came with an underlying criticism, a reminder that Eleanor was an outsider who had married into a family with centuries of tradition. The textile division has exceeded projections this quarter, Eleanor said diplomatically. The new international contracts are proving very profitable. Profitable, yes, Margaret replied, settling into one of the leather armchairs with practiced grace. But profit isn't everything, is it? The Thornfield name has always stood for more than mere financial success. We represent tradition, stability, and proper values. These things cannot be measured in quarterly reports. James shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. Mother, Eleanor has done wonderful things for the company. The expansion into European markets alone has— I'm not questioning Eleanor's competence, Margaret interrupted, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm simply reminding you both that business success means nothing if we lose sight of what makes our family special. Eleanor felt her patience wearing thin. Margaret's constant emphasis on proper values and tradition was thinly veiled criticism of Eleanor's more progressive approach to business and life. Eleanor had implemented fair labor practices, environmental initiatives, and family-friendly policies that Margaret viewed as unnecessary and expensive. Perhaps you could be more specific about what concerns you, Eleanor said, her voice carefully controlled. Margaret's eyes gleamed with something that might have been anticipation. My concerns are complex, Eleanor. They relate to the future of this family and the preservation of everything we've built over generations. But this isn't the time or place for such a serious discussion. The implied threat in Margaret's words was clear to Eleanor, though James seemed oblivious. Margaret was testing the waters, gauging how much Eleanor knew about her plans. When would be an appropriate time? Eleanor asked, meeting Margaret's gaze directly. Soon, Margaret replied, rising from her chair. Very soon, I think. James, dear, would you walk me to my car? I'd like to discuss the charity board meeting with you. As James obediently followed his mother from the room, Eleanor sank into the chair Margaret had vacated, her mind racing. She needed to develop a strategy quickly. The letter had mentioned a family meeting scheduled for the following week, where Margaret intended to present her case to the other family members and the trust lawyers. Eleanor knew she had allies among the extended family. James's cousin Robert had always been supportive, and his Aunt Catherine had expressed admiration for Eleanor's business acumen. But she also knew that Margaret wielded considerable influence, and many family members were traditional in their thinking. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Eleanor considered her options. She could confront Margaret directly, but that would likely force an immediate confrontation before Eleanor was prepared. She could warn James, but his relationship with his mother was already complicated, and this revelation might devastate him. What Eleanor needed was evidence of Margaret's own unfitness to judge others. She thought about Margaret's favoritism toward David, despite his numerous problems. In the past year alone, David had crashed 2 expensive cars, been arrested for drunk driving, and accumulated massive debts from gambling. Yet Margaret consistently defended him, claiming he was simply high-spirited and would eventually settle down. Eleanor rose and moved to the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. It showed 3 generations of Thornfields, all looking stern and aristocratic in their formal poses. She studied Margaret's painted face, noting the artist's skill in capturing both her beauty and her cold determination. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that Margaret was willing to destroy her own son's future to maintain control over the family fortune. James had spent his entire life trying to earn his mother's love, working tirelessly to prove himself worthy of the Thornfield name. Now Margaret was prepared to cast him aside based on his honesty about seeking help during a difficult period in his life. Eleanor pulled out her phone and began making notes. She would need to research the family trust documents carefully, looking for any provisions that might counter Margaret's planned maneuver. She would also need to document David's recent problems and Margaret's pattern of covering up his mistakes while holding James to an impossible standard. As she worked, Eleanor felt a familiar determination settling over her. She had built a successful career before marrying James, and She had proven herself capable of handling complex challenges in the business world. This was no different. It was simply another problem that required careful analysis and strategic thinking. The library door opened, and James returned, looking tired and slightly confused. "Mother was asking strange questions about your background," he said, settling beside Eleanor on the sofa. "She wanted to know about your family's financial situation when we married, whether you had any debts or legal problems. I told her those questions were inappropriate, but she insisted she was just being protective of the family." Eleanor felt her anger flare. Margaret was building a case not just against James, but against her as well. The older woman was clearly planning to portray Eleanor as a fortune hunter who had married James for his money and was now influencing him to make poor decisions. "James," Eleanor said carefully, "I think there's something you need to know about your mother's recent activities." Before she could continue, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Thornfield's number, and Eleanor answered quickly. "Eleanor," Robert's voice was tense. "I just had a very disturbing conversation with Aunt Margaret. She's asked me to attend a special family meeting next week." She wouldn't give details, but she mentioned concerns about James's ability to handle the inheritance. "Do you know what this is about?" Eleanor met James's confused and increasingly worried gaze. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I do. Robert, can you come over tonight? There's something we all need to discuss." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor realized that the battle for the Thornfield legacy was about to begin in earnest. Margaret had thrown down the gauntlet, and Eleanor would have to marshal all her resources to protect the man she loved and the future they had built together. The rain outside had intensified, matching the storm that was brewing within the walls of Thornfield Manor. Eleanor looked at James, seeing the fear and confusion in his eyes, and made a silent promise. She would not let Margaret's manipulations destroy him, no matter what it cost her. The following evening, Robert Thornfield arrived at the manor just as the last light was fading from the October sky. Eleanor watched from the drawing room window as he emerged from his car, his usually confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. As James's closest cousin and a successful lawyer in his own right, Robert had always been a stabilizing force in the family's complicated dynamics. Eleanor had spent the day carefully preparing for this conversation. She had copies of the intercepted letter, detailed financial records showing the company's growth under her guidance, and a comprehensive timeline of David's recent problems that Margaret had systematically covered up. "This is serious," Robert said without preamble as he entered the drawing room. He declined the offered drink and instead pulled out a folder of his own. "I've done some research since our call yesterday. Margaret contacted my law firm last week, asking for references to specialists in trust law and mental competency evaluations." James went pale. "Mental competency? What does that even mean?" "It means," Eleanor said gently, taking her husband's hand, "that your mother is trying to prove you're unfit to inherit the family estate and business." The silence that followed was heavy with shock and disbelief. James stared at Eleanor as if she had spoken in a foreign language, his mind struggling to process the betrayal implied in her words. "That's impossible," James whispered. "My mother would never. She's been preparing me for this responsibility my entire life. Why would she suddenly?" Robert opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "I wish Eleanor was wrong, James, but the evidence suggests otherwise." Margaret requested information about the legal procedures for challenging inheritance arrangements based on mental instability. She specifically asked about cases involving anxiety disorders and their impact on business judgment. Eleanor watched her husband's face crumble as the reality settled in. The man who had dedicated his life to earning his mother's approval was confronting the devastating truth that she viewed him as fundamentally inadequate. "But I've been in therapy," James said, his voice barely audible. "I've dealt with my anxiety. I haven't had a panic attack in over 2 years. The business is thriving under my leadership. Your success is exactly what makes this so cruel," Robert replied, his anger evident. Margaret isn't acting based on genuine concerns about your abilities. This is about control. She can't bear the thought of the family legacy passing to someone she can't manipulate. Eleanor spread the intercepted letter on the coffee table between them. There's more, James. Your mother has been building her case for months. She's gathered statements from people who witnessed your difficult period 3 years ago, and she's recontextualizing your responsible decision to seek professional help as evidence of mental instability. James read the letter with growing devastation. The document outlined Margaret's strategy in clinical detail, reducing his personal struggles to legal ammunition. Eleanor watched him discover that his own mother had interrogated former colleagues, friends, and even household staff about his behavior during his most vulnerable period. She interviewed Mrs. Henderson, James said, referring to their longtime housekeeper. She asked her about times when I seemed stressed or upset. Mrs. Henderson thought she was just being concerned about my well-being. Robert leaned forward, his expression grim. James, I need you to understand something crucial. If Margaret succeeds in this challenge, the inheritance won't simply be delayed or modified. Under the terms of the trust, if you're declared unfit, you'll be permanently barred from inheriting. The estate and business would pass to the next eligible heir. David, Eleanor said flatly. Exactly. And given David's track record, that would be a disaster for everyone involved. The business, the employees, and the family's financial stability. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a car, doors slamming outside, announced an unexpected arrival. Eleanor looked through the window to see David Thornfield stumbling slightly as he made his way to the front door. Even from a distance, it was clear he had been drinking. Perfect timing, Robert muttered as they heard the front door open and David's loud voice echoing through the entrance hall. David burst into the drawing room without knocking, his expensive clothes disheveled, and his usually handsome features marred by the telltale signs of too much alcohol and too little sleep. At 32, he possessed the same dark hair and strong jawline as his older brother, but where James carried himself with quiet dignity, David exuded reckless charm and barely contained chaos. Well, David said with a mocking smile. Isn't this cozy? The family brain trust having a secret meeting without me. David, you're drunk, James said wearily. Perhaps you should go home and sleep it off. Drunk, David laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I prefer celebratory. I just had the most interesting conversation with dear mother. It seems she's finally coming to her senses about the family succession. Eleanor felt her blood turn cold. What did Margaret tell you? David threw himself into an armchair with theatrical flair, clearly enjoying the attention. She told me that certain people in this family have been living under false assumptions about their futures. She mentioned that loyalty and stability matter more than temporary business success. Robert's voice was carefully controlled. Did she specifically discuss the inheritance arrangements with you? Let's just say I've been advised to prepare myself for increased responsibilities, David replied smugly. Mother believes it's time for someone with true Thornfield values to take charge of the family legacy. James stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. True Thornfield values? You've been arrested twice this year, David. You've accumulated gambling debts that would bankrupt most people. You crashed a car just last month while driving under the influence. Mistakes, David waved dismissively. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young. The important thing is having the right bloodline and understanding what this family represents, unlike some people who married into it for financial gain. The insult hung in the air like a poison cloud. Eleanor felt James tense beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. Getting into a confrontation with David would only give Margaret more ammunition about James's emotional stability. David, Eleanor said calmly, are you really prepared to destroy your brother's future based on lies and manipulation? David's expression turned cunning. Oh, Eleanor, always so dramatic. No one's destroying anything. We're simply ensuring that the right person inherits the responsibility. Mother has concerns about James's ability to handle stress, and, frankly, so do I. What concerns? Robert demanded. James has run the company brilliantly for the past 2 years. Profits are up, employee satisfaction is at an all-time high, and the international expansion has been tremendously successful. Numbers on a spreadsheet, David scoffed. But what happens when real pressure hits? Remember 3 years ago when James had his little breakdown? Mother and I were the ones who had to cover for him while he was having his emotional crisis. Eleanor saw James flinch at the cruel characterization of his struggle with anxiety, and her anger flared. James didn't have a breakdown, David. He recognized that he was under enormous stress and sought professional help like a responsible adult. That shows strength, not weakness. Does it? David's smile turned predatory. Because I seem to remember several occasions when James couldn't even attend important business meetings because he was too anxious. I remember him having panic attacks in the middle of board presentations. How is that strong leadership? That was 3 years ago, James said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. I've overcome those challenges. I've proven my capability through results. David laughed again, the sound harsh and mocking. Have you, though? Because Mother has been keeping track of your recent behavior, and she's noticed some concerning patterns. The way you avoid certain high-stress situations, your reluctance to take on new challenges, your dependence on Eleanor for decision-making support. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Margaret had been orchestrating a campaign of psychological warfare against her own son. She had been observing James with the clinical detachment of a prosecutor building a case, interpreting normal caution and collaborative decision-making as signs of mental weakness. That's enough, Robert said firmly. David, you're drunk, and you're saying things you'll regret tomorrow. I suggest you leave now before this conversation becomes something we can't come back from. Oh, but we're already past that point, aren't we? David replied, his earlier joviality replaced by genuine malice. The truth is finally coming out. James isn't fit to lead this family, and everyone knows it. Mother has simply found the courage to admit what we've all been thinking. James stood frozen, absorbing blow after blow from his younger brother. Eleanor could see him retreating into himself, the old patterns of self-doubt and anxiety threatening to resurface under David's relentless assault. You're wrong, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. But let's talk about fitness to lead, shall we? Let's discuss your gambling addiction that cost the family £50,000 last spring. Let's talk about the drunk driving arrest that Margaret paid to make disappear. Let's discuss the assault charges that were dropped when the family made a generous donation to the victim's medical expenses. David's face darkened. Those were private family matters. Exactly. Eleanor continued relentlessly. Private matters that Margaret covered up while building a case against James based on his honest acknowledgement of mental health challenges. The hypocrisy is staggering. Robert was taking notes, his legal mind clearly working. David, are you admitting that Margaret has been monitoring James's behavior specifically to build a case for inheritance challenge? David seemed to realize he had said too much. His earlier confidence wavered as he apparently sobered up enough to recognize the legal implications of his words. I'm not admitting anything, he said carefully. I'm simply pointing out that Mother has legitimate concerns about the family's future direction. Legitimate concerns, James repeated, his voice hollow. 3 years of therapy, 2 years of successful business leadership, and she's still convinced I'm unfit because I once had anxiety attacks. Eleanor moved closer to her husband, offering what support she could through simple presence. She could see the psychological damage David's words were inflicting, undoing years of progress and self-acceptance. James, she said softly, your mother's opinion doesn't define your worth or your capabilities. The business results speak for themselves. The employees respect you. The board has full confidence in your leadership. Do they? David interjected with renewed cruelty. Because Mother has been speaking with several board members about her concerns. She's planted seeds of doubt about James's long-term stability. People are starting to ask questions. Robert's expression grew thunderous. That's corporate interference, and possibly illegal manipulation of fiduciary duties. Margaret is overstepping her authority and potentially violating her obligations to the trust beneficiaries. Eleanor felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Margaret wasn't just targeting James personally. She was systematically undermining his professional reputation and business relationships. This was a coordinated campaign designed to create the very instability she claimed to be concerned about. "How long has this been going on?" Eleanor asked David directly. "How long has your mother been poisoning people against James?" David's smirk faltered as he realized he might have revealed too much about Margaret's strategy. Mother is simply exercising appropriate oversight of family interests by sabotaging her own son's career and mental health. Robert's voice was incredulous. "David, even you must see how destructive this is." For a moment, David's mask slipped, and Eleanor saw something that might have been shame or uncertainty cross his features. But it was quickly replaced by defensive anger. "The family comes first," he said, though his convictions seemed forced. "Individual feelings don't matter when a Thornfield legacy is at stake." "What legacy?" James asked, his voice gaining strength for the first time since David's arrival. "A legacy of backstabbing and betrayal? Of destroying family members who don't conform to impossible standards? Is that really what you want our name to represent?" David stood unsteadily, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his brother's quiet dignity. "You don't understand the pressure of carrying this family's expectations." "Don't I?" James stepped forward, his pain transforming into determination. "I've lived with Mother's impossible standards my entire life. I've sacrificed my own happiness trying to become the son she wanted. And you know what I've learned? Nothing will ever be enough for her, because this isn't really about the family or the legacy. It's about power and control." Eleanor felt a surge of pride, watching her husband find his strength in the face of such cruelty. This was the man she had married, not the anxious, self-doubting person his mother had tried to make him believe he was, but a thoughtful, capable leader who had the courage to seek help when needed and the wisdom to learn from his struggles. David seemed to deflate under James's steady gaze. Without another word, he turned and stumbled from the room, leaving behind only the lingering smell of expensive whiskey and cheap malice. Robert was already pulling out his phone. "I need to make some calls. If Margaret has been interfering with business relationships and board communications, we need to document everything immediately. This goes beyond family disputes into potential legal violations." Eleanor sat down beside James, who was staring into the fireplace with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I won't let her destroy you," she said quietly. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, I won't let her win." James turned to her with a sad smile. "The terrible thing is, I think she's already won in some ways. Even if we defeat her legally, even if we save the inheritance, the damage to our relationship is permanent. I'll never be able to trust her again, and she'll never forgive me for fighting back." "Maybe that's not such a terrible thing," Eleanor replied gently. "Maybe it's time you stopped trying to earn the love of someone who's incapable of giving it, and started building relationships with people who value you for who you really are." As Robert spoke quietly into his phone in the corner of the room, arranging emergency meetings with lawyers and accountants, Eleanor realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. But for the first time since discovering Margaret's letter, she felt a flicker of hope. The battle for the Thornfield legacy was far from over, but they were no longer fighting it alone or unprepared. And, perhaps most importantly, James was beginning to understand that his worth wasn't determined by his mother's approval, but by his own actions and the love of people who truly knew and supported him. The emergency meeting Robert had arranged took place 3 days later in the offices of Whitmore and Associates, the prestigious law firm that had represented the Thornfield family for over 30 years. Eleanor sat beside James in the mahogany-paneled conference room, watching as their legal team assembled an impressive array of documents, financial records, and expert testimonies. Senior partner Harold Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 70s who had known the family for decades, reviewed their case with the careful attention of someone who understood both the legal complexities and the personal stakes involved. The situation is more serious than we initially thought, Whitmore began, his grave expression reflecting the weight of his findings. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield has indeed been building a comprehensive case for challenging James's inheritance rights. However, in her zeal to remove James's heir, she has overstepped several legal boundaries. Eleanor leaned forward, hoping for good news. What kind of boundaries? Whitmore's assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah Chun, opened a thick folder. We've discovered that Mrs. Thornfield has been using her position as trustee to access confidential business information specifically for the purpose of undermining James's reputation with key stakeholders. She's also been making unauthorized inquiries into his medical history. James's jaw tightened. How is that possible? I never gave her permission to access my medical records. She didn't access them directly, Sarah explained. But she has been questioning people who might have indirect knowledge of your treatment, including former colleagues who witnessed your anxiety episodes. She's also been selectively sharing information about your past struggles with board members and business partners, framing it as legitimate concerns about leadership stability. Robert, who had been taking detailed notes, looked up with anger in his eyes. That's character assassination masquerading as family concern. Whitmore nodded grimly. Indeed. But here's where Margaret made her crucial mistake. In her determination to build an ironclad case against James, she documented everything. We've obtained copies of her correspondence with various parties, and it's clear that her actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty as a trustee. Eleanor felt a spark of hope. Does that help our case? It does more than help, Whitmore replied with the first smile they'd seen from him. It provides grounds for her removal as trustee and potentially invalidates any inheritance challenge she might mount. A trustee cannot use their position to actively sabotage a beneficiary's interests. James remained quiet throughout the legal discussion, his expression thoughtful but distant. Eleanor knew he was struggling not just with the legal implications but with the emotional devastation of his mother's betrayal. Learning that Margaret had systematically undermined him while pretending to support his leadership had shaken his confidence in ways that went far beyond the inheritance dispute. There's something else, Sarah continued, consulting her notes. We've been investigating David Thornfield's financial situation as part of our case preparation. What we found is extremely concerning. She spread out a series of bank statements and legal documents. David's gambling debts are far more extensive than the family realized. He owes approximately £200,000 to various creditors, some of whom are becoming increasingly aggressive in their collection efforts. Eleanor studied the paperwork with growing alarm. Margaret has been covering his debts. Some of them, Sarah confirmed. But the amounts have escalated beyond even her ability to manage quietly. There's also evidence that David has been using family business connections to secure loans, essentially leveraging the Thornfield name for personal gambling funds. Robert whistled low. That's fraud. If David defaults on those loans, it could impact the family business's credit rating and banking relationships. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. It gets worse. We have reason to believe that Margaret's sudden urgency about changing the inheritance isn't just about control. It's about protecting David from the consequences of his actions. If David inherits the estate, he'll have the resources to pay off his debts and avoid potential criminal charges. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret wasn't just playing favorites. She was actively engineering a financial cover-up that would saddle the family business with David's irresponsible debts while removing the one person capable of managing the crisis responsibly. So this entire inheritance challenge, Eleanor said slowly, is essentially a scheme to use family money to bail out David's gambling addiction. That's our assessment, Whitmore confirmed. Margaret has convinced herself that she's protecting the family's reputation, but in reality, she's enabling David's destructive behavior while punishing James for seeking help with his own challenges. James finally spoke, his voice steady but sad. My mother always said that family loyalty was the most important value. I never imagined that her version of loyalty meant destroying one son to save another. Eleanor reached for his hand, offering what comfort she could. James, you can't blame yourself for her choices. You've done everything right. You sought help when you needed it. You've proven your leadership capabilities, and you've built a strong marriage and business partnerships based on honesty and mutual respect. Eleanor's right, Robert added. The contrast between your approach to challenges and David's is stark. You faced your problems responsibly, while David has been running from his and expecting the family to clean up his messes. Sarah pulled out another set of documents. Actually, that brings up an important point for our strategy. We need to prepare for Margaret's formal challenge, which our sources indicate will happen at the family trust meeting next week. She'll likely present her case by contrasting James's past anxiety issues with David's supposed stability and family loyalty. Whitmore nodded, which is why we need to be prepared to present the full picture. James's anxiety was a medical condition that he addressed responsibly and overcame. David's problems represent a pattern of criminal behavior and financial irresponsibility that threatens the entire family's security. Eleanor studied the timeline Sarah had prepared, noting the correlation between Margaret's inheritance planning and David's escalating financial problems. When did Margaret first contact you about trust law specialists? Sarah checked her calendar. 6 weeks ago. That was just 3 days after David's largest gambling debt became due and the creditors started making serious threats. So the timing isn't coincidental, Robert observed. Margaret panicked when she realized David was facing real consequences, and she decided to solve his problems by giving him access to the family fortune. James stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. You know what's ironic? If David had come to me directly about his problems, I would have helped him. We could have arranged for treatment, debt consolidation, and a structured plan to get his life back on track. Instead, Mother chose to handle it through deception and betrayal. Eleanor joined him at the window, seeing the pain in his reflection in the glass. Your mother has always believed that control is more important than trust. She couldn't risk asking for your help because that would require admitting that David isn't perfect and that her judgment has been flawed. Whitmore cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the conference table. I need to prepare you for what's likely to happen at next week's meeting. Margaret will present her case with considerable drama and emotion. She'll focus on James's past struggles while minimizing David's current problems. She may even have prepared testimony from people who witnessed James's difficult period. What kind of testimony? James asked, returning to his seat. Sarah consulted her notes. We know she's spoken with Dr. Matthews, your former therapist, though he was limited in what he could say due to confidentiality agreements. She's also interviewed several former colleagues and business associates who were present during your anxiety episodes 3 years ago. Eleanor felt a surge of anger. So she's essentially putting James on trial for having a mental health condition that he successfully treated. That's exactly what she's doing, Whitmore confirmed, which is why our counter-strategy needs to be both legally sound and emotionally compelling. We'll present evidence of James's successful recovery and outstanding business leadership, contrasted with documented evidence of David's ongoing criminal behavior and financial irresponsibility. Robert leaned forward. What about the other family members? Where do they stand? Sarah had prepared profiles of all the trust beneficiaries and family members who would attend the meeting. Aunt Catherine has expressed strong support for James's leadership and has been impressed with the business growth under his direction. Uncle Peter is more traditional in his thinking, but respects business success. Cousin Michael is young and tends to follow Catherine's lead. And the wild cards? Eleanor asked. Aunt Dorothy has always been close to Margaret and may support her position regardless of the evidence. Cousin Elizabeth is unpredictable. She's had her own conflicts with the family over the years and might see this as an opportunity to shake things up. Whitmore stood, signaling that the meeting was drawing to a close. Our strategy will be threefold. First, we'll challenge Margaret's fitness to serve as trustee based on her breach of fiduciary duty. Second, we'll present comprehensive evidence of James's successful leadership and mental health recovery. Third, we'll expose the true motivation behind this challenge by documenting David's financial crisis and Margaret's role in enabling it. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor felt both hopeful and apprehensive. They had strong legal grounds and compelling evidence, but family dynamics weren't always governed by logic and fairness. Margaret had been the family's de facto leader for so long that some members might support her simply out of habit or fear. James remained quiet during the drive home, lost in thought as he processed everything they had learned. Eleanor knew he was struggling with more than just legal strategy. He was grappling with the fundamental destruction of his relationship with his mother and brother. "I keep thinking about when I was a child," James said suddenly, as they pulled into the manor's driveway. "Mother always told me that strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting doubt or fear. I spent so many years trying to live up to that impossible standard." Eleanor parked the car, but didn't immediately get out. "And now I realize that real strength means being honest about your limitations and getting help when you need it. It means building relationships based on trust rather than control. Everything Mother taught me about family loyalty was actually about submission to her authority." Eleanor turned to face him, seeing a new clarity in his expression. "So what do we do with that realization?" James was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the manor that had been his family's home for generations. "We fight for what's right, but not because we're trying to prove anything to her. We fight because the family business employs hundreds of people who deserve responsible leadership. We fight because David's gambling addiction will destroy everything our ancestors built. And we fight because our future children deserve to inherit a legacy of integrity, not manipulation and enabling." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the man she had fallen in love with. Not the anxious, approval-seeking person his mother had tried to create, but the thoughtful, principled leader who had emerged from his struggles stronger and wiser. "Then, let's go prepare for battle," she said, taking his hand as they walked toward the house that would either remain their home or become a monument to Margaret's misguided sense of family loyalty. The next week would determine not just the inheritance, but the kind of family the Thornfields would become for future generations. Eleanor was determined to ensure that love and integrity triumphed over manipulation and control, whatever the cost. The family meeting took place on a crisp November morning in the same library where Eleanor had first discovered Margaret's letter. The room had been transformed into an informal courtroom, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a large table where Harold Whitmore and Margaret's legal team would present their cases. The autumn sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, created an almost ceremonial atmosphere for what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in the family's history. Eleanor sat beside James, noting the tension in his shoulders as family members filed into the room. Aunt Catherine arrived with her characteristic warmth, immediately crossing to embrace James and express her support. Uncle Peter followed with his usual formal politeness, though Eleanor detected sympathy in his careful nod to James. Cousin Michael looked uncomfortable with the entire proceedings, while Cousin Elizabeth entered with the calculating expression of someone anticipating drama. Aunt Dorothy arrived with Margaret, the two women presenting a united front of aristocratic disapproval. Dorothy had always been Margaret's closest ally, sharing her traditionalist views and skepticism about change. Her presence served as a reminder that Margaret wasn't entirely isolated in her campaign against James. David entered last, looking significantly better than during his drunken visit several nights earlier. He had clearly made an effort to appear responsible and stable, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and projecting an air of sober confidence that Eleanor knew was carefully manufactured for this occasion. Margaret herself was a study in controlled elegance. She wore a severe black suit that emphasized her authority and commanded respect. Her silver hair styled in an imposing arrangement that added to her height and presence. She had clearly prepared for this meeting as if it were a military campaign, complete with strategic positioning and psychological warfare. Harold Whitmore called the meeting to order with the solemnity appropriate to such a significant family moment. We're here today to address concerns raised by Mrs. Margaret Thornfield regarding the inheritance provisions of the Thornfield Family Trust. Mrs. Thornfield has requested a formal review of the current heir designation based on questions about fitness to inherit. Margaret rose with practiced grace, her voice carrying the authority she had wielded over the family for decades. Thank you, Harold. I've called this meeting because I believe we face a crisis that threatens everything our family has built over generations. The Thornfield name has always represented stability, wisdom, and strength. These qualities cannot be taken for granted or assumed to exist simply because someone bears our name. She paused, allowing her words to settle over the assembled family members. Eleanor noticed that Margaret was carefully avoiding direct eye contact with James, focusing instead on the relatives whose support she hoped to secure. 3 years ago, James experienced what can only be described as a mental breakdown. Margaret continued, her voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. He was unable to perform his basic duties, suffered from panic attacks during important business meetings, and required extensive psychological treatment. While I'm grateful that he received help, I cannot ignore the implications for our family's future. Eleanor felt James tense beside her, but he remained silent as they had planned. Responding emotionally to Margaret's provocations would only reinforce her narrative about his mental instability. Margaret produced a folder of documents, her presentation clearly rehearsed. I have statements from colleagues who witnessed James's episodes. I have medical records indicating ongoing treatment for anxiety and depression. I have business records showing decreased productivity during his illness. Most concerning, I have recent observations suggesting that the stress of leadership continues to affect his judgment and decision-making. Aunt Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Margaret, surely you're not suggesting that seeking mental health treatment disqualifies someone from family responsibility? That seems rather antiquated. I'm not questioning the value of treatment. Catherine, Margaret replied smoothly. I'm questioning whether someone with a documented history of mental instability should be entrusted with a fortune that affects not just our family, but hundreds of employees and thousands of shareholders. Uncle Peter cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing as an alternative? Margaret's carefully controlled mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of triumph. David has demonstrated remarkable maturity in recent years. He's shown strong family loyalty, business acumen, and the kind of steady temperament required for leadership. I believe he would be a more suitable heir. Eleanor nearly laughed at the audacity of calling David's behavior remarkable maturity, but she maintained her composure as Whitmore began their counterpresentation. Before we consider any changes to the inheritance structure, Whitmore said, I believe the family should have all relevant information about both potential heirs. He began methodically, presenting James's business achievements over the past 2 years. The numbers were impressive. 40% profit growth, successful international expansion, improved employee satisfaction, and industry recognition for innovative practices. More importantly, these achievements had occurred during the period when Margaret claimed James was struggling with ongoing mental health issues. Mr. James Thornfield has not only recovered from his anxiety disorder, Whitmore explained, but has used the self-awareness and emotional intelligence gained through treatment to become a more effective leader. His willingness to seek help when needed demonstrates the kind of responsible decision-making we should value in family leadership. Eleanor watched the family members' reactions as Whitmore presented medical testimony from James's current physician, confirming his complete recovery and mental fitness. Dr. Sarah Williams, a respected psychiatrist, had provided a detailed assessment of James's current mental health status, emphasizing that his previous anxiety had been successfully treated and posed no ongoing risk to his judgment or capabilities. But Whitmore's most devastating revelation came when he began documenting David's financial situation. The gambling debts, the fraudulent use of family business connections, the escalating criminal behavior, all presented with clinical precision that stripped away any pretense of David's suitability for leadership. David Thornfield currently owes approximately £250,000 to various creditors, Whitmore announced, watching the shock register on several family members' faces. Some of these debts were incurred using the Thornfield family name as collateral, creating potential liability for the family business. Aunt Dorothy gasped audibly. "Margaret, you never mentioned anything about gambling debts." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Those are temporary financial difficulties. David is young and learning to manage his responsibilities. Unlike some people, he doesn't run away from pressure by seeking psychiatric treatment." The cruel jab at James proved to be Margaret's crucial error. The assembled family members could see the meanness in her attack, the way she was willing to weaponize mental health stigma against her own son. James chose that moment to speak for the first time. "Mother," he said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than Eleanor had ever heard from him. "You're absolutely right that leadership requires facing pressure rather than running away. That's exactly why I sought professional help when I recognized that my anxiety was affecting my performance. A responsible leader addresses problems directly instead of pretending they don't exist." He stood, his calm presence contrasting sharply with Margaret's agitation. "I've learned that real strength isn't about appearing perfect or maintaining control at any cost. It's about making decisions based on truth rather than fear, about building trust through honesty rather than demanding submission through manipulation." Eleanor saw several family members nodding in recognition of James's growth and wisdom. Even Uncle Peter, traditionally conservative in his thinking, appeared moved by James's dignified response to his mother's attacks. "David," James continued, turning to his brother, "I want you to know that even after everything that's happened, my offer of help stands. Gambling addiction is a serious condition that requires treatment, not enablement. If you inherit the family fortune in your current state, it won't solve your problems. It will only make them bigger and more destructive." David's carefully constructed facade of competence began to crumble under his brother's compassionate but direct challenge. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said, his voice defensive and pleading. "The creditors are threatening." "Exactly," Margaret interrupted, apparently realizing that David was revealing too much. "David is facing external pressures that require family support, not judgment." Robert, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the proceedings, stood with a folder of additional documents. "Actually, the external pressures David faces are entirely self-created and ongoing. We have evidence of gambling activity as recent as last week, including attempts to secure additional loans using anticipated inheritance as collateral. The revelation that David was still actively gambling, even as his family faced this crisis, seemed to be the final straw for several family members. Cousin Elizabeth shook her head in disgust, while Aunt Catherine looked at David with disappointment that was painful to witness. Whitmore presented his final piece of evidence, documentation of Margaret's abuse of her trustee position. The unauthorized inquiries into James's medical history, the selective sharing of confidential information with business associates, the systematic campaign to undermine his professional relationships, all presented as clear violations of fiduciary duty. Mrs. Thornfield has used her position as trustee not to protect the family's interests, but to advance her personal preferences, Whitmore concluded. Her actions have potentially exposed the family to legal liability and certainly violated the trust and confidence that position requires. The room fell silent as the weight of evidence settled over the assembled family. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her carefully constructed case collapsing under the truth she had tried so hard to conceal and distort. Aunt Catherine was the first to speak. Margaret, I've supported you for years because I believed you were acting in the family's best interests. But what I've heard today suggests that your judgment has been clouded by favoritism and denial about David's problems. Uncle Peter nodded gravely. The business results speak for themselves. James has proven his capability and stability through measurable achievements. David has proven the opposite through his actions. One by one, the family members expressed their support for maintaining the original inheritance structure. Even Aunt Dorothy, Margaret's closest ally, seemed shaken by the revelations about financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. David suddenly stood, his composure finally breaking completely. "This isn't fair," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I never asked for any of this. Mother convinced me that I deserved the inheritance, that James was weak and unstable. I just wanted someone to fix my problems." The raw honesty in David's confession created a moment of profound silence. Eleanor felt a surge of pity for him, recognizing that he too had been victimized by Margaret's manipulations, albeit as a willing participant. Margaret rose with as much dignity as she could muster. "I see that my concerns have been dismissed and my motives questioned. I will not subject myself to further humiliation in this forum." "Mother," James said, standing as well, "it doesn't have to be this way. We can still be a family, but it has to be based on honesty and mutual respect, not control and manipulation." Margaret paused at the door, her back rigid with wounded pride. "You've chosen your path, James. I hope you can live with the consequences." After Margaret left, followed by a shamefaced David, the remaining family members spent another hour discussing practical arrangements. Margaret would be removed as trustee, replaced by a professional management company with Robert serving as family liaison. David would be offered treatment for his gambling addiction and financial counseling, but his access to family money would be strictly limited until he demonstrated genuine recovery. As the family meeting concluded and relatives began to leave, Eleanor found herself alone with James in the library where this ordeal had begun. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room that had witnessed so much family drama and pain. "How do you feel?" Eleanor asked, settling beside her husband on the sofa where they had spent so many evenings planning their future together. James was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and sad. "Relieved, I think, and grieving. I've finally stood up to my mother and protected our future, but I've also lost the relationship I spent my entire life trying to build with her." Eleanor took his hand, offering comfort through simple contact. "Maybe what you've lost wasn't really a relationship. Maybe it was just a pattern of control and submission that prevented you from being yourself." "Perhaps," James agreed. "I keep thinking about what I want to be different when we have children. I want them to know they're loved unconditionally, not because they meet impossible standards or fulfill my expectations for them." Eleanor smiled, thinking about the future they were now free to build together. They'll know that, and they'll have a father who teaches them that seeking help when needed is a sign of strength, that honesty is more valuable than control, and that real family loyalty means supporting each other through difficulties rather than enabling destructive behavior. James pulled her closer, and they sat together in comfortable silence as darkness settled over Thornfield Manor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for the first time in months, Eleanor felt genuinely hopeful about their future. The Thornfield legacy would continue, but it would be defined by integrity and compassion rather than manipulation and control. Margaret had tried to preserve the family's traditional power structure, but had ultimately succeeded only in freeing her son to become the leader and man he was truly meant to be. Outside, the November wind rustled through the bare trees, carrying away the last leaves of autumn and making room for whatever new growth spring might bring. Inside the manor, a young couple held each other close, finally free to build a life based on love, truth, and mutual respect, values that would serve them well as they prepared to carry their family's name into a brighter and more honest future.